But I'm a huge sucker for anybody who goes the extra mile, right? Very detail oriented. Anybody who has more than a 1.5-page CV, for example, I typically ask the recruiter to tell me why on earth we should even carry them forward. Definitely days of cover letter are gone, right? So I am on the biased side of saying covering letters are useless. It's very easy to say to the tech leader, listen, if you want him to be hired in 3 days, I can give you only such CVs, right? You need to understand why he is in a hurry or she's in a hurry. It is a great advantage to start your career as a TA person. In fact, many of the top leaders in the large organizations who have become HR heads today started their journey as TA leaders.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Weekday Show. I'm your host, Amit Singh, founder and CEO of Weekday, a hiring marketplace where job seekers can 8x their chances of finding their perfect job, and recruiters can supercharge their productivity by accessing the largest database of talent in the country. We have 80% of white-collar workforce of India on our platform. Check out Weekday at weekday.works. Happy to present to you the Weekday Show, where recruitment leaders share actionable insights and answer the most common hiring FAQs, and explore the hiring process from both sides, and dissect real-life interview scenarios.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Weekday Show. I'm your host, Amit Singh, founder and CEO of Weekday. Happy to present to you the Weekday Show, where recruitment leaders, HR leaders share actionable insights, and we answer the most common hiring FAQs, explore the hiring process from both sides, and dissect real interview scenarios. Our guest for today is Anish Raju, who has more than 2 decades of experience in the HR space. He's currently the SVP of HR at Qualitest, which is one of the leading engineering services company, employs more than 5,000 people globally. I'm not sure if this is updated. Is it more, Anish?
So yeah, we are currently running at around a little under 7,000.
Okay. Yeah. So more than 7,000 people. He has also worked in a bunch of other large organizations like Alorica, Accenture, as well as startups like Quad Fitness, which we'll talk about in this due course of this podcast, how different the two sort of sectors are. But today, in our episode, we'll talk about 3 major segments. The first is a rapid fire, where we do fun and fast questions about hiring. Then we'll go into deep dive, where we learn more about Anish's HR journey. And the third is hire or pass, where we analyze real interview scenarios and what goes on into the HR space. Okay, let's start with rapid fire. Anish, what's the most creative way a candidate has ever tried to stand out from the crowd?
Yeah, so this is more a mixture of a role that was tech, business analysis, and a little bit of BD pre-sales. This was around 5-6 years back. And so we were hiring a bunch of people, typical experience range, as always in the Indian industry, slightly larger software services firm, right? Experience and the number of years was important. Things have changed now, right? So we were looking at folks with about 7 to 9 years of experience, more managerial caliber, so-called maturity, etc. But we had one candidate who was, let's say, he had worked for a firm which was not a very well-known firm, and no more than 3-4 years of experience. However, what stood out was that clearly he knew, right? So he needs to have some other joker up his sleeve, right? So this guy, what he had done, he had analyzed which part of the organization we were hiring for from the JD, spoken to the recruiter, and done a very detailed presentation and a deck and said, listen, allow me the ability to take you through this deck, right? So he did that. And he insisted that he take us through the some kind of a SWOT analysis, and we were floored, right? It was first the recruiter. The recruiter, she said, listen, I want you to speak to this guy. Typically, I would eliminate, but please speak to the guy. Then I insisted that he also be lined up with the hiring manager, a senior guy. Eventually, we rolled out an offer, and he joined, right? So not your traditional idea of what creativity is, but I'm a huge sucker for anybody who goes the extra mile, right? Very detail oriented. And obviously for a business analysis, come tech and BD role, you need a bunch of high-end communication skills. This guy wowed us, and obviously...
But did he end up performing after he joined as well?
He went phenomenally well and growing way beyond. It's in a previous firm. I'm still in touch with the guy, right? Eventually, I asked him, and so this may not be one of your questions, but typically this is what good recruiters do, right? I asked my recruiter to find out from him who are the kind of people he's interacting with and he's friends with, right? And we hired 3 more similar people with similar profiles from similar firms, right? And so we turned it around and made it some kind of a supply chain. So yeah, quite interesting. Not your typical definition of creativity, but hey, if you ask me, in the tech world, that is what creativity means, right? Detail orientation and seeing where this will head to, and not just the wrapper, as it were, right? So that's what I would say. Message I would have for folks who are looking to convert this conversation into something useful, of value or action, is go the extra mile for every single step you take, because instead of applying, let's say, for, in the current scenario, 30 roles, you would rather apply for 10 to 15 roles, but go the extra mile for each one of them. Your chances will be much higher, right? It's like a cold pursuit versus a comparatively warmer pursuit in the language of sales. That's what I would say.
Okay, awesome. So taking a slightly grimmer route, like what is the most useless skill you have seen on a resume?
Unfortunately, I am personally fairly biased, and sometimes overly so, in terms of what should make it on a CV and what should not, right? Anybody who has more than a 1.5 page CV, for example, I typically ask the recruiter to tell me why on earth we should even carry them forward. Having said that, if anybody talks about stuff like spoken, written language, etc., they're a direct reject. So if you ask me, that is the most useless skill, right? Talk about what you have used very specifically, especially in the last few roles that you have done, or last few projects you've done. Anything else is pointless. That's what I would say.
Okay, so anything which is which they had done like in school and sort of way back, that's not as relevant now.
Meaningless, right? Yeah. So in general, now there are pluses and minuses of this, but we are all moving. I mean, most of us are moving away from credential focused and credential heavy hiring to skill focused hiring, right? Unfortunately, we are still in a system and a country where it's, for the larger firms more so, but definitely for the smaller firms, it's not the case. Credentials are important, but skills are getting more and more important. Nothing new for anybody here in the overall market here. And therefore, I'm saying focus on the skills that you have applied and showcase how, I would say action point would be how you have utilized this for what? X numbers, Y numbers, some project, what benefit to the client, etc. That's what I would say.
Okay, perfect. All right. And a similar question, like what interview question do you think is the most overrated, and like what you should ask?
So this is easy, right? Because these are things that I tell my interviewers when I take them through basic skills of how to interview. I tell them not to ask these questions. One of them you may find controversial. I honestly, personally, I am of the personal and professional opinion. Maybe the organizations that I have represented in the past, even right now, may not necessarily agree. So be warned, do your own research. This is my professional opinion. It is pointless for me. I don't want to know why you're leaving your current job. You have been included into the skill portfolio of this interview system because I like what I see. I don't care why you're leaving, right? It is for me to figure out whether you're good enough for my role or not, right? So I don't want to reject. I want to select. So that's one question. And the other is one of the most useless is, especially in the current skill focused scenario in the environment, I don't want to know where you see yourself 2 years from now, 5 years from now. That's up to me. That's up to you. These are the two questions I would say.
So I agree with the second one. I don't actually agree with the first one.
Yeah, so your mileage may vary, as they say in automobiles, right? I am fairly biased about this.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about it in the due course, but let's move on to the next one. So what's the biggest interview red flag you have ever encountered?
Oh yeah, once again, this should not be a surprise, right? If you figured out by now about detail, I would, it is easy for me and my recruiting team, based on my conversations with them, to reject if the candidate expresses the slightest of doubt about what the role is, what the organization is, where specifically he or she will fit in. Because all those details have typically already been shared by the time after the screening discussion, the interview has started, right? You should have asked your questions and understood. If you haven't done that, you haven't done your due diligence, and therefore it is easy for me to reject, right? That is one of the, unfortunately, it is very common. And especially till about a year back when the supply side versus the demand side, the demand was higher and the people were taking it really lackadaisically. And so that's a huge red flag for me.
Have you ever seen like a very strong candidate which fit the sort of job requirement perfectly, bomb like a simple question? And what are those generally simple questions?
Yeah, so typically, I say in my overall experience, I've hired for 3 or 4 types of profiles, right? One is from an experience profile or from a tech profile, the task folks, the execution folks, the folks who are actually getting down and coding or playing around at the execution level or team leader manager level, or folks who are senior folks. And the fourth variety is the corporate function types, the function analysis types, etc., right? So the latter two typically do a far better job. Obviously, if I ask them questions about where they see this fitting in the larger picture, their communication skills are better, etc., etc. And while I typically try to make them as comfortable as possible, because I'd like to have my interviews more as discussions and back and forth conversations. Many candidates, especially in the younger age range, get nervous, right? And so typically questions about why do you specifically want this role versus the 1 or 2 other offers, for example, that you have, especially in the last 2 years, right? Not questions about the future. How do you see yourself progressing? Why do you want to do this skill versus that skill, especially if this is a high demand skill, this is not a high demand skill? Why this client versus that client? Those are the kind of questions they get nervous about. My experience of a good candidate is they are good typically at what they're asked to do, right? Which is skill, but sometimes not able to see slightly larger contexts. So that's typically what they bomb at. Bomb, of course, is slightly harsh term, but I can understand why you're using that, right? So if you go slightly higher level and ask context-related questions, that is typically when they bomb.
And that's why we're doing this sort of series as well, to just help people understand what exactly, like, you should not be as nervous. What exactly are the, like, if you know exactly what is the person expecting out of you, it would be like you would be much less nervous if you were going that scenario.
Yeah, my guess is that most of your audience are either engineers or engineering bent of mind, right?
Yes.
We know, you and I know, right, that these are folks who have the capability to crack the hardest of elimination criteria because they've done that for their courses, right? What is stopping you, therefore? Action point here, right? What is stopping you from doing the same? Consider this also as a selection, literally. I mean, we're in India here, literally as a selection exam. Don't see it as any different, right? It can make or break, right? The detail you come across, you would rather over prepare, is what I would say, right? So that's what I would leave you with as an action point.
All right, great, Anish. This was great. Let's move on to our deep dive section, and let's understand you a little bit more. Like, let's talk about like what you did post your B school. How did you get into HR? What sort of led you to it? Did you think that this was the sort of thing for you, or was it something that you stumbled upon? Just let's go through that.
Absolutely. So you said it, a little bit of the stumble upon and a little bit of luck, right? I'll be honest. I'll also say that I was privileged to start my career when the industry was on an uptrend and it kept going up for the last 20, 25 years, right? Fairly boom times. So having said that, you won't believe it, but initially I wanted to be a finance guy, right? Most far removed from being an HR guy. But I did a summer project and I realized that I'm far more a typical cliched one, right? Not necessarily, I'm not your typical people person type of an HR guy, right? Comparatively left brain.
Why do you say that?
Yeah, because in a situation, so actually let me step back. Why do I say that? So by the way, as it so happens, I'm a Gallup certified executive coach, right? So when Accenture moved away from a performance-based to a coaching-based performance management system, there are about 200 of us globally who became coaching certified. And so we all ran coaching workshops. And so I literally use the Gallup Strengths Framework, which is 34. Now Discover Your Strengths, for example, most famously popularized by the book Now Discover Your Strengths, right? So if you do a Gallup Strengths inventory, you get what your top 5 strengths are, which is what are the personality traits that most likely you are going to use to do any job, right? Which is you get hired for skills, but you use your personality traits to do a different way of the same job that I will do a different way, right? So I'm using the Gallup framework to help you understand that I am more analytical, futuristic, intellectual than I am, let's say, development oriented. Not that I'm not development oriented, right? So I am going to look at every task or project or program or HR process as slightly more of a problem to be solved, right? Interestingly, I do believe that in today's day and age, with having moved past machinistic automation and now coming to self-driven and AI-based, I think, by the way, my view, once again, could be controversial.
Yeah.
For both TA and HR leaders, these are the kind of skills I believe that are going to be increasingly important, right? But otherwise, as a function as such, there is always the issue that we are not at the table. Anyway, having said that, so this is why I say that's my style, right? So I veered away from finance and I moved into HR after I did an internship, and I spoke with a bunch of people and I did some so-called inner work, more meditative in nature between my first year and my second year, right? And that's how I did my HR electives as well as on the side some advertising and marketing. In fact, I almost got a role as a copywriter in Mumbai and another role as a factory HR guy, and I chose the factory HR role. Interestingly, things might have been different.
Okay.
So that's how I entered. And in my
what led you to choose between the two? Like, what were the decision factors, and what tilted the scale this side?
So in my worldview, then, right, I was enamored by the fact that I could use my writing ability as a copywriter for rediffusion. But I also knew in my heart of hearts that what is the most I can do, even if I excel 1 in a million or 1 in a billion, will become a Prasoon Joshi type of a guy, right? If you're aware of the advertising world, somebody like that, or an Ogilvy, for example, right? Whereas I have a far greater opportunity to climb any ladder I want, whether independently as an HR guy or as a so-called corporate person, right? And so I chose this, and I realized over time that it was the right decision because I would rather immerse with people and take people-based decisions, analytical or not, than be a creative or a suit in the advertising world, right? It is interesting, by the way, my wife also, who's an HR leader, she heads HR for Asia Pac for the 4th largest advertising firm in the world, Dentsu. It's quite interesting. But anyway, more on that later. So,
would that be your ideal job?
Yeah, that would be. Actually, I don't know, right? I don't want to head HR for a bunch of folks who are so right-brained, it might be difficult to run HR processes for the organization. Right? I'm joking. This is what I tell her, right? But they clearly have a ball, right? Including her. And she's suited to it. I'm not. It's as simple as that, right? I would be a square peg in a round hole. But I had another creative pursuit in terms of my fitness and coaching, but that's another discussion. Now, interestingly, my journey took me through your typical things that engineering and tech-oriented folks do, right? Switch jobs every so often to get into a better role or more pay. I did all of that until I hit Nokia. And then from then on, I'd like to joke that after Nokia, every organization, either the company shut down or got acquired, or I had an epiphany. Therefore, I went to do something else, right? I joined Nokia at a time when when the IPL started. Yes, that long ago. And I was there for the first match when Brendan McCullum made his century. Nokia was there on KKR t-shirts. And we had a ball, and then the bust happened, right? At the Burning Platform interview, Nokia shut down. I had an option to join Accenture. I joined Accenture. I did my 8-9 years of Accenture, and I learned a hell of a lot in these two organizations. And from then on, I had the so-called epiphany. I was having issues with my physical fitness, and so I had become a student at a fitness firm here in Chennai. I worked with them for 4 years as a client. And then I realized that I want to learn more. I became a certified kettlebell coach, a nutritionist coach, as well as an animal flow coach, and so on and so forth. And I said, hey, if I've done all this, why don't I come run something for you as well? So I joined Quad Fitness myself after having said to Accenture that I'm going to leave in 3 months, right? COVID happened, so we lost half our students. And so I made a deal with my friends and founders that, listen, I got to go back, because at the same time, my wife also lost her role. And then I joined one PE-funded organization. Stuff happened in typical startup style. Then I joined, and then I hit Qualitest. So that's life. But for me, these have all been amazing learnings. Right? I've grown as a person. I've seen the business side of stuff. I have learned skills that I otherwise would not have learned if I was purely sticking to the corporate world, right? Which is why I'm excited when I speak to risk-taking folks like you, who are literally stars. I mean, so to speak. So that's been my journey.
Okay, thank you so much, Anish, for this. So now let's talk about a little about like HR. So what all exists within HR? Like for example, for folks who have not interacted with anyone from this field and would most likely have had like half an hour or like 45 minutes conversations with people who are into HR. What all exists within HR? Like what are the different domains? What do people do within it? Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
For sure. So the easiest way to understand it is to look at typical left brain way of looking at it, right? Which is to look at the human resource function also like a supply chain, right? From start to end, right? So obviously, pre-entry there is screening, the background check part, etc., and then talent acquisition. So that's TA, right? And behind all of this, by the way, there is a back-end operations that runs to ensure that the entry point is clean, the credentials and the claims made are clear, right? So there's talent acquisition and there is the background check team as part of the HR shared services team. So these are the two functions. As the person comes in, there are a bunch of things that happen. Let's say to a person is just like you go see a movie and you are welcomed into the cinema theater, right? So the joining, the form filling, the government mandated stuff, all of that is handled typically either by shared services or by a typically an HR representative, etc., or an HR business partner. So the HR business partner it represents another function, the third function, which is typically the engagement partner or the HR partner, depending on what organization, or the people advisor, large firms call it that, right? So that's employee engagement as a function, the entire life cycle. Then within that, there are multiple functions that the employee is exposed to and has to go through, right? There is the whole cycle from goal setting to feedback to performance rating at the end. And then based on that, developmental as well as the most important for most, if not all of us, what happens in terms of dollar or rupees at the end, which is compensation, right? So each of these is a sub-function, right? So there is, in larger organizations, there will be performance COE, compensation COE, etc. Otherwise, typically in most organizations, mid to small, there would be the employee engagement or people advisory team or function, which would handle that entire cycle, right? Feedback, compensation, etc., etc. And then exit. And so I'm giving you a very broad overview for people to understand, because I don't want to get into too many nitty-gritties. For slightly more future-focused organizations, every once a year or every once in 2 years, more enlightened organizations would figure out, for my top 20 roles or for my top 5% roles, right? Who are the successors? How can I map talent and figure out a future for them? So that would come under the function of talent management. So that's, I would think this would cover about 80 to 90% of the roles. If, like my current organization, we grow hugely by mergers and acquisitions, then a global mergers and acquisitions function would be some function in which there would be one or two folks figuring out how do I get new organizations in. I am 3,000 employees strong in India. I hire another 700 people. Hey, presto, on let's say June 5th, by the way, hypothetically. Nothing like that is going to happen in Qualitest necessarily. I hire or acquire an organization, 700 employees in one day land, right? So I would have a people side of mergers and acquisitions. This would literally cover most, if not all, functions in HR. I hope that's what you were looking for, Amit.
Yes, exactly.
Are you struggling to hire talent? At Weekday, we have built a database of 80% of white-collar workforce with their email, phone number, resume, and salary details. And you can send automated email plus WhatsApp plus call sequences to them. Yes, we call candidates on your behalf as well. Because India runs on WhatsApp and calls, we end up getting as high as 40% response rate. Gone are the days of sending a LinkedIn invite and waiting for days for someone to accept. Just use Weekday. Whether you are looking for a database to supercharge the productivity of your recruiters, or you're looking at a complete AI recruiter to do everything for you, we have a solution for you. Visit weekday.works to know more.
Yeah.
So let's go a little deeper into, for example, let's talk about the acquisition part, which is the first sort of part. Uh, within that, because that's like most of the people, when they're like, for example, with this conversation, we're targeting more towards the top of the funnel side, which is basically interviews and how do people get it. For example, for acquisition folks, like what exactly happens after, let's say there's a role that has been opened, uh, there is a job that I see on a careers page of any particular company. What happens behind that? If I apply, what happens behind all after I apply and then I wait for like forever?
Yeah. So, like, this may be true even of small organizations today, because online tools are now available at every price point and scale for most of all organizations, right? So, therefore, TA and recruiting also, I would think I would answer this in the context that typically 99% of us are using some tool, rudimentary or cloud-based or large, for talent acquisition, right? And in the talent acquisition world, that is typically some cloud-based tool for which the organization is creating a job description, right?
Mhm.
So everything is therefore pegged to what job or what role you are being hired for, right? So this thing called a job description or a role gets created in the system. You hire let's say, let's put it this way: I am the candidate, and you are representing the organization into which I am being hired.
Okay.
I am one of, let's say, 50 people who applies for a particular role in the organization, and you represent the TA person hiring for it as well as the hiring manager. Let's say there are two of you, right? I hire against it. Typically, if it is a hot skill or a role that needs to be fulfilled fast, or as of yesterday, as most of my leaders tell me, right? 90% of the roles in today's environment they need to be fulfilled immediately, right? Which means
Okay.
we are the talent acquisition team. Unfortunately, 50 to 60% of the time is looking for somebody who is in the hunt, and which means they are already being approached by other folks as well, right? And so here, speed becomes of the essence, right?
Yes.
And so action point for those who want to get recruited is, everything you do, you should think about being able to make life easy for the recruiter. So I should make life easy for you as the recruiter, and present my case as something that is ready to eat meal for my hiring manager, right? So I have, as a person wanting to be recruited as a candidate, I have two people who I have to serve, right?
Mhm.
My first customer is the gatekeeper, the recruiter, the screener. And the second main customer is, once I get into the interview funnel, the hiring manager or the first interviewing panel or interviewer. In most cases, typically two rounds, right? The person who does the screening and the recruiting, and the person who's going to do the, let's say, the final round. I will take only two cases, right? So I submit my CV, some sort of a CV, against some sort of a system. It is an automated talent acquisition system, ATS. It will hunt for some words in the CV. It will pull that up. Screening will happen, and somebody who passes the filter of 75% or 80% or 7 out of the 10 skills that I'm looking for will get screened, passed successfully by the recruiter. Recruiter will call you, somebody from your organization will call me. I'll have an initial conversation, then I'll get set up for the final interview, and then I'll get through. Right?
Okay.
So I want to pause.
My question
Yeah.
is, so the resume that I'm making, is
Yes.
the resume I'm making for the ATS? Is the resume I'm making for the resume screener? Or is the resume that I'm making for the hiring manager? So which persona should I have in mind when I'm making the resume?
Yeah. So from now on, many questions, my response to you will be depends, right? Here is where you have to, I as a person candidate has to figure out what organization, what type of company I'm applying for, right? If it's a typical large SI, right? I am actually needing to get hired by the ATS, not by the recruiter, right? Because it's a machine. The machine does 80% of the job, right? If it is a small and medium or a startup, then a lot depends on the person doing the screening. Like, for example, in my own previous startup experience, right?
Yeah.
In the days and the evenings, I was running the coaching business, and because I was the only person in that 50-member team who had some semblance of HR, I was running HR and recruiting and payroll as well, right? So I'm spending 4 to 5 hours a day, once or twice a year, trying to figure out from where I will get fitness coaches, right? Though it is not a technology thing, we still have our own tool, right? In an organization of the size of 50, 100, 200, 300 people, you have to get past, you are actually fitting a CV for the screening person, right? And in some cases, if you can figure out that you've got past the screener, there is no harm then in asking the person who's doing the screening to say, thank you for setting up this discussion. I would want to just send out an email to that person saying, apart from the CV, now that you've selected me, I'd like you to look at this as well, right? Definitely days of cover letter are gone, right? So I am on the biased side of saying covering letters are useless, right? But once you get past the screener, yeah, by the way, you will hear a lot of biased opinions. I would rather have even candidates who take a side, right, and go all in, right, instead of hedging their bets. Don't make a generic CV. Firstly, action point, right? There is nothing called a generic CV. Please tailor every single CV for the role or the organization you're going for. Especially for you, if you are under 3 years, right? It is even more required, because how are you going to get differentiated? For persons who have more than 3-4 years of experience, differentiation becomes easier and easier comparatively, right? So 300 to 500 employees, 100 employees, startup, been in existence for lesser time, or wanting to hire fast for a very specific role, right? For all you know, the hiring manager could be doing the screening themselves. In those cases, be specific, be very, call out specifically what you think is required and answer to that, right? So that's what I would say. So it depends.
So let's say we're talking about larger organizations.
Yes.
Is there a guarantee or like a probabilistic chance, high chance, that if I have included all the keywords that the job description asked for, the ATS will actually surface my profile and my profile will actually be seen by a recruiter?
So
or what are those numbers? Can you tell us a little bit about the numbers? Like, okay, once there's an opening, how many applications end up being received?
In the current scenario, right, for 0 to 3 years of experience, especially at a time when, some organizations started going back to campus as well. Campus is not happening, right? Which means I have a mountain load of folks trying to apply. The numbers are huge, right? So for some 4 or 5 roles, let's say that a large SI, the top 6 or 7 SIs in India, plus the top 3 or 4 global MNCs, they are literally getting, my recruiters are going to get thousands of CVs. Right?
Okay.
And so I don't know whether I should say this out in public and you're going to publish this, right? But I'll still go say it. However, I will say 2 things before I say this, right? Firstly, DYOR, as they say in the crypto and finance world, do your own research. And 2, these are my professional opinions. I don't represent the current or the previous organizations where I'm taking cases from, right? It would be smart of you in the 0 to 3 years of experience to go look back at all the previous JDs and roles that they have actually come out with. Don't get stuck by the current JD alone, right? So just like a good recruiter is constantly on the lookout for candidates which may be needed 6 months from now, as a candidate 0 to 3 years of experience, I'm not asking you to leave your role every 2 years, but I am asking you to stay up to date for your skill. Let's talk about specifically, since I'm in the engineering services, hardware and software testing, AI testing business, basic skill, let's say Selenium, right? If I am looking at 3 or 4 organizations for that particular skill, I should have them on my radar and be looking at the kind of JDs they're doing. So when an actual JD comes up, right, that is when I fashion my CV and include all those words, not just for this JD, but for the previous as well. Then your chances of getting selected probably go up from, let's say, a 5%, 10%, 15% to 30%, 40%. That's a huge boost. That's what I would do if I were you. Right? Do not get stuck with the current JD or the current role. Right? And obviously, by hook or by crook, not illegal, use LinkedIn to get connected to tech recruiters, right? Not HR folks. In that sense, I am useless for you to connect with, right? Your LinkedIn has value if you're connecting with your peers in organizations as well as tech recruiters, because they are the gatekeepers, because we're not talking about large organizations. Now I'll pause to check if this was either vehemently controversial, or it was of some use for your audience?
No, I think that those are the things that are not talked about, right? Like for example, this is a tactical thing that people don't
Tactical.
really know, right?
That's right.
Okay, so is there anything else that I can do to increase my chances of my resume being seen by a recruiter?
So I would say, I'm going to repeat at the risk of repeating over and over again, right? Please look at your CV with an extremely 80-20 mentality. There should not be a single word there that is of no use, right? Because
But
if
that word might be of use for the ATS, right?
it could be, right? But I'm talking about stuff for example, nobody cares today what you have done in your 12th standard, for example, right? Unless you are unless you know you're applying for an organization which is publicly known for needing that, right? What's the point?
Okay.
I don't want to
Yeah.
know. Right now, if you're from a
Yeah.
BITS Pilani, please mention that. Uske pehle, what's the use, right? I don't want to know about the courses that have no relation to the role that you're doing. Don't mention them. Which is why I said there is nothing called a generic CV. Have a simple, imagine yourself as the person who is doing the coding for that ATS who's been built, right? And extremely simple CV, nothing fancy required. PDF is also okay, that's fine. But I don't want to know anything beyond your name, your email ID, and your phone number. I don't need to know your age also. What will I do with that, right? So I'm saying to that extent, eliminate everything that you can do. Extremely skill focused, right? And make life easy.
Got it. And so let's say a person has done that. So and let's take an example of like a role. Let's say that role is a Java engineer. What exactly within that resume would a person be looking for? Like, what exactly are they looking for if they're, let's say, hiring for Qualitest?
Yeah, so my ATS and my recruiter are primarily looking for 2 or 3 things, right? At a very basic level, the ATS is going to tell me, hey, the guy has a skill required, Java in this case, right? Then my recruiter is going to look at what are the kind of clients he or she has worked for, and what kind of work, either front end or back end, development or maintenance, and what kind of projects he or she has done, right? So these are the 3 things. The skill, typically the client can or cannot be named, but I would say take the risk of mentioning the client's name. That's fine, right? In 90% of the cases, mention the client. Not a problem. Once again, I could be taken to task for saying this publicly, but not an issue, right? It's not a big deal. And if you can mention specifics, be as detail oriented as possible. That's what I would say. These 3 things are enough to get you from 10 to 30% acceptance.
Okay, perfect. All right. So while we close the deep dive sort of section, what advice would you have for other recruiters or other HR professionals who are looking up to you and saying that how can I replicate the journey that you have had? Not to like obviously the same extent, but reach the same final destination that you have reached.
I'll be frank, right? Because of the time or the decades that I have traversed, some of what I did in my earlier career may not be relevant, right? But I'll probably tell 1 or 2 things that could be of use as an action based on what I have seen in the last 5 to 8 years specifically, right? It is crystal clear. Like I said earlier, it is crystal clear that today, if you're looking specifically to be an HR or TA leader in the tech world, right? The tech leaders definitely want you to understand the business cycle, the ups and downs, and the technology that you're hiring for. Don't be a specialist, right? You need to be a generalist, even if you are specializing in some HR function or the other. That's what I would say. Understand finances, understand the numbers. Then you will understand why my India head or my UK head or my BFSI head or the guy who's hiring for a fintech SaaS or whatever it is in a hurry and wants that person to be hired on Monday. It's very easy to say to the tech leader, listen, if you want him to be hired in 3 days, I can give you only such CVs, right? You need to understand why he is in a hurry or she's in a hurry, why he is upset or frustrated that the 6 CVs you gave him, that one person that he called did not take the call because the call was set up at 7 p.m. Why, right? What is the revenue loss? The understanding of the business is much more important today than it was. I was lucky in that sense in the first 10 years, right? So that is one extremely important skill. And the other is naturally, if you are in the recruiting business, you are not in the business of hiring for the current role. You are 50% in the business of figuring out what next will come up and having a catchment ready for that. That is definitely the number two.
So one follow-up to that, Anish. So most HR folks who start off, like at least because of the current market environment as well, start off in the in the talent acquisition space. At least that's true for the people that I've
That's
interacted
right.
with.
Yeah.
If they want to move to like a people advisor and L&D function, is it fine to be stuck to that? I don't know if I get a role in that particular sector, and that is generally translatable to even other functions as well. Like if someone wants to move to another field, is it fine if they start off and pay their dues doing the different function and moving within the organization?
It is absolutely okay, right? And here is where the idea of what a smaller organization itself is different today, right? Today, a small organization is, even you are comparatively large, right? A small organization is one person, right? In that context, it is absolutely fine for anybody to, if you're looking for an HR career, it's absolutely fine for you to do your due in every single sub function or spend time being a specialist also. That is absolutely fine. In fact, I would say the TA function, I would doff my hats off to the TA function because they are far more business focused and street oriented than any other function in the HR business, except probably for if you are a super specialized compensation guy who's also really close to the numbers, right? And I'm saying this because I've done my due in every one of these, right? So because if like, let's put it this way, as a startup guy, for example, the first HR guy you would hire would be either somebody who, technically not even an HR guy, a payroll guy and a TA guy, right? Everybody else, you can figure out some jugaad or the other, right? So I would say it is a great advantage to start your career as a TA person. In fact, many of the top leaders in the large organizations who have become HR heads today started their journey as TA leaders, right? I won't take names here, but I had a similar experience in Accenture, where for the business that I was working for a long period of time, my India HR head for one of the three businesses that I was running HR for was somebody who had done his due for a long time as a TA guy and then moved into so-called HR business partner, right? So it is far easier for a TA person to move into HR business partner role than the other way around, by the way. So that's the other interesting thing, right? At least based on my personal, probably controversial opinion.
So, like the way I'm running parallels here is, for example, a lot of my friends, which is in a different domain, which is like engineering people, want to move into a product management function.
Right.
So, if you start
Yes.
with a product manager to begin with, it's harder to move to any other domain versus if you start off as a software engineer, you can move into much other functions.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've literally done the hard yards.
Okay, all right. Great, Anish. Let's thank you for this. Let's move on to our last and final section, which is hire or pass.
Yes.
Wherein I'll give you certain scenarios, and you'll have to tell me whether this is a yes or a no, like a hire or a pass. So the first persona is the entrepreneur. So this candidate is like a serial entrepreneur, has done multiple startups, might not have scaled as much, but has wanted to do his own thing, but now is looking out a job in a structured corporate environment. Do you see that as a strength or a risk?
So I would say hire and strength in most cases, but the depends comes in as long as the organization is confident that from a cultural perspective, they can assimilate that person's. An entrepreneur brings a certain energy and passion and masala, right?
Yeah.
And in most cases, larger organizations work at a different pace, right? So consulting-led organizations or comparatively so-called ruthless organizations can assimilate such people far easier than comparatively process-related organizations, right? And so that would be the only depends. But I would say hire any day. In fact, as a current example, my leader who's running TA as a sub-function, right, was an entrepreneur who ran his own RPO before we hired him, right? Amazing. right? So I have a live example where, so for example, even in a function like HR, right, we have so many folks who are running their own organizations outside of typical corporate environment, servicing for that particular part, L&D or TA or learning services or HR consulting, etc., etc. The good folks there will do a phenomenal job internally, right? Internal consultants, I would call them, right? So hire. I would say hire and definitely not pass.
Okay, so hire for the entrepreneur. Okay, move on to the next one. Hire or pass the job hopper, like a candidate early in their, who are, let's say, early in their career and are changing jobs frequently. Would you say that as a hire or pass from a completely non-biased view now? Because if, let's say, you had not done the same thing in your early career to figure out which is your calling.
Yeah. So in my own career, right, I have gone through phases where I've had different answers to this. Okay. In today's environment, I would say depends, but I would be 55% higher, 45% pass, or slightly more, right? Because remember, we are moving more and more towards a skill-related world. That is the reality, right? I am typically servicing a need, and that need needs to be fulfilled by a person who has a skill, right? If I'm not confident that the role is good enough, and all the 4 or 5 things typically that go into wanting a person to come to us, right? Which is the brand, the work, the manager, the team, the culture, and the compensation. If I'm not okay with that being good, I'm not going to be able to satisfy even a person who's not a job hopper, right? That is the fun part, right? And that is the situation in which I would say I'm okay, which is why I said earlier, I don't really care. I don't want to know why you're leaving your current organization. I have to figure that out myself, right? Yeah. So it definitely depends, but this also depends on what kinds of situations the person, I mean, is the person, for example, has he left 3 jobs in the last 15 months? Then I have to dive deep into it. Twice in the last 3-4 years, or 2 years, 3 years, I can understand why, and I will still do a deeper job of interviewing for skills and fit. Slightly more weird towards higher.
Okay, got it. The next one, hire or pass, the overqualified applicant. So someone who, in terms of years of experience and qualifications, is, let's say, like, yeah, it is overqualified. Should they still apply? Like, for example, someone who's overqualified for a particular job, should they still apply for it? So is this overqualification like a strength or a risk? Is it hire or pass?
And see, this is where having a strong opinion helps, right? I don't care, right? If you really want to apply for the role and you have applied, I'm going to interview you and I'll figure out if you'll fit or not. That's up to me as the recruiter, as the hiring manager, as the company. I don't care whether you are qualified or not. Right? So I don't see a risk at all. The question is actually up to you as the candidate. Are you crystal clear that you will know, right? Overqualified means you know you're overqualified. Why are you applying for the role? If you are clear you are applying for the role, which means if you're overqualified, you may not be happy with the offer, etc., etc. That's for you to figure out. Right? So I have made it a point in large or small organizations and startups I've worked for that I'll make it crystal clear. This is what we offer you. This is what we can. Let me also try and desell. I cannot do this for you. Even for my good candidates, I will undersell. That is typically what a recruiter should do who is good at doing. Right? And those are the recruiters and the companies which get the best people and have comparatively, so-called people frown at this, but comparatively longer tenures with better performance, right? Because they've desold instead of overselling the role. So that is my take on it. I don't care. Come over. Qualified, bus. Good enough.
Yeah. All right. So the other, so we talked about job hopper. The other side of the spectrum are people who have stayed in one particular organization for a much longer. Let's say someone who has 10 years of experience has stayed in one company only for their entire career. Do you see that as a risk? Do you see that they might be too set in their ways in whatever the organization they were earlier, or do you see that as a strength that they are actually loyal to a particular employer?
Right. So in a typical situation, I am going to ask what all they have done in those 10 years in one organization, or 8 years. More likely, tenure nowadays is like people cross maximum 4 to 5 years and then have this issue, right? So I would typically find somebody who has done maximum 5 years, not more than that. It's rare to find more than that. Let's be very honest, right? So I'm like a unicorn in this situation. 8 years and all, nobody stays, right? So I would then ask, what all roles have you done? Did you take additional assignments, right? Did you move from one role to the other because you said you are thinking you are stagnating, etc., etc., every 2 years, every 3 years, or did you take on additional assignments? That is what is important for me. Once again, do you meet the criteria for me uh, uh, in my menu card? I want this combination. Do you meet that? And have you displayed and showcased that urge? That is what is important for me. You could have stayed in that company for years or not, right? So you could have the same year of experience repeated 5 times, 5 years, or you could have done 2 or 3 different roles. What matters is not experience, but assignments, skills, and growth. So in that sense, right? So this is a true depends. There is no higher
So
or lower.
typically, like, if someone has, let's say, stayed in an organization for 8 years, they would have ideally moved in, like, let's say, every 2-3 years they've moved to a slightly different function, take on more responsibilities. In that case, you're saying it's a higher, right?
Yeah, then I really don't care, because then once again it's coming back to, do you meet my skill and qualification criteria or not?
Okay, awesome.
So in today's environment,
So
I would say action point, right? If I can, sorry
okay.
to add, if I can,
Yeah.
the smart thing to do would be mention separately each of those experiences. Don't mention it as a single block, right? See,
Yes.
you have to think like the recruiter and the ATS and the hiring manager. How are they going to read it? Oh, I'm looking for people who are taking risks, high performance, right? I will mention it separately. I'm hiring for a large organization. More likely, the person is actually, unlike me, looking for people who have blocks of experience. Present it like that. No generic CV. That's what I mean.
Yeah, that's what most people do, right? Like, there's one block and then this bullet points. Then the bullet points keep on increasing, but not the sections.
Exactly. Yeah. By the way, I have an issue with people using bullet points and making it one essay page itself, right? This is not a 12th standard examination paper. Please, 2 pages.
Yeah.
If you have more than 10 years experience, you're allowed to have 2 pages. That's the way I look at CVs. Most people look at CVs like that, right? Please.
Okay, so should it be 1 page? So it's 1 page under 10 years. If then more than 10 years, then also try to be 1 page.
Yeah. So over 10 years, you have the ability to go over 1 page is what I would say. But that's me.
Okay.
I am an extremist in that sense.
All right. Okay. So this was great, Anish. Thank you so much. As we part, what is one advice you would like to give to job applicants? Could be one of the multiple ones, call-outs that you have given during this conversation. Could be another thing as well, or the most important thing among the call-outs that you have given.
See, now this may sound cliched, but one I've already said, so I won't repeat, right? Focus on being detail oriented and customized every time. I've said that enough times, so I won't repeat it. The other is, like, as a typical HR guy and a coach, this may sound really cliched, but I'll tell you it is increasingly more important, right? We are living in crazy times, right? So focus on self and take care of yourself, right? Because if you don't take care of yourself and you're not in a okay state of mind, health and mind wise, it is going to come through in your CV. It is going to come through in your email. It is going to come through when suddenly, after applying for 65 organizations, finally the 66th recruiter calls you, you will sound not okay, right? So this is really crazy, right? But if you do not have a way to somehow have some downtime, right? Or something, whether it is fitness, whether it is carom, whether it is IPL, whether it is walking, biking, figure out something, because if you don't take care of yourself, it is going to come through to the recruiter. Like, I'm going to be extremely focused on your audience and tell you that if you come across as frustrated or angry, the recruiter will pick it up immediately. The recruiter is no different from, in that sense, a psychology magician, right? Because my recruiters have been speaking and will continue to speak. This is what they do for a living, right? So come across as a kind and professional person, and good things will come your way.
Okay, on this great note, thank you so much, Anish, for a lot of nuggets of information and a lot of things to unpack here for people. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining the Weekday Show. Thanks.
Are you looking for a job? You can 8x your chances of getting one by using Weekday. How 8x? By doubling the chances on 3 fronts: referrals, customizing your resume, and applying to double the jobs. Weekday can help you on all 3 fronts. Did you know that you can double your chances of getting a job by asking referrals? You can do that via Weekday by just one click, where people can give referrals to the existing companies via the Weekday platform. The second one is customizing your resume for every role. Did you know that 60% of the applicants of a job are never seen by a human recruiter? You can double your chances by customizing your resume based on every job posted. Well, it's not feasible to do that. You can do that via AI. So Weekday's Chrome extension allows you to customize your resume for any job. The third front is applying to double the jobs. Imagine if there was an easy apply on every careers job posted everywhere. What we allow via front-end automations is that you can just click once and no need to fill multiple long forms on every careers page. Give that information to us once and utilize it everywhere else.